Good morning, everyone. My name is Michelle Minihan. I'm the Senior Inspector within the Drinking Water Team in the Environmental Protection Agency, and I'm delighted to be here with you this morning on the second day of the National Federation's webinar. I'm here today to talk to you about contaminants of concern, and I wanted to thank Barry and the Federation for inviting me to be here with you today. So what do we mean by contaminants of concern? Well, I wanted to focus on drinking water quality in our private water supply with respect to a number of parameters: E. coli, intracocci, pesticides, nitrates, manganese and THMs. And many of you will have experience of these in your water supplies, or you'll be aware of them from your dealings with the Federation. I'm also going to look as well at the recast of the Drinking Water Directive, which is coming at us for transposition by January 2023. So if we focus on drinking water quality in our private water supplies, the EPA's most recent report on the quality of drinking water in our private water supplies for 2019 highlights that 95.2% of private group schemes complied with the bacterial limits in 2019. This 95.2% is much lower than compliance in our public water supplies, where 99.1% of public water supplies were compliant with the bacterial limits. And this is the gap that needs to be bridged and the one we're focused on in the EPA. That 95.2% amounts to 20 supplies with bacterial failures in 2019. And I suppose, why is that important? Well, we all know that disinfection is the most important step in the water treatment process. It's what makes the water safe to drink and removes the harmful bacteria that can make people ill. The failures we reported in 2019 were due to a number of reasons, but they amounted to a lack of operational disinfection infrastructure being in place at the water treatment plant, power supply issues, and management practices. And all of these can be addressed, and they need to be addressed. But I suppose what is most important is that when disinfection failures occur, it is important that action is taken to protect public health by advising the local authority and the HSE and the issuing of a boil water notice. This will ensure that consumers on that supply are protected from the harmful bacteria that can make people ill. Our report also highlighted monitoring for E. coli, and we all know that monitoring is critical to ensure the supply is safe to drink. It is the responsibility of the water supplier to ensure they are monitoring the water they supply and that it complies with the requirements of the drinking water regulations. I'm happy to say that all group water schemes were monitored for E. coli in 2019, as they should be, and 19 supplies had E. coli failures in 2019, or 98.5% compliance. It's important that each E. coli failure is investigated by the private water supply and followed upon to make sure that the reasons and root causes are determined and actions are put in place to prevent a reoccurrence. I'd like to move on now to some of the other parameters of concern, or contaminants of concern. Most of you will be familiar with pesticides and the standards for individual and total pesticides that are set out in the current drinking water regs. You'll all be aware that these are quite low, the standards that we are required to meet are quite low, and whilst they don't have a health-based effect, it's clear that activities in the catchment can have an effect on the water quality of the raw water source, which is our rivers or lakes. That's why a focus on source protection and catchment activities have been at the heart of the actions taken to address pesticide exceedances in our private water supplies and in our public water supplies. The National Federation of Group Water Schemes are a part of the National Pesticides and Drinking Water Action Group, and it's important that the framework for drinking water source protection that the Federation has developed is now implemented. This will also be critical as we move towards the transposition and introduction of the new Drinking Water Directive in January 2023, and this is something that I'll come back to later on in my presentation. Nitrates are another contaminant of concern, and we generally find that they occur because of contamination from the use of fertilizer or because human or animal organic waste has made its way into our water supply. That can be the river or lake that's being used to abstract water for the water treatment plant, or it can be our groundwater. 4 group water schemes failed to meet the standard in 2019, and that standard is 50 micrograms per litre. That 50 micrograms per litre limit is a health-based limit, and usually the result of failing to meet the standard is that a do not consume notice is necessary for all consumers on the supply affected. This is particularly onerous when it is put in place, but it is rightly put in place to protect public health. There are a couple of treatment options available for nitrate removal. On exchange units are available, or the water can be blended with another water supply that has much lower levels of nitrates in it, or no nitrates in it. But again, a focus on source protection and catchment activities is critical to understand the use of nitrates around our water sources. I think manganese is probably one of the most pressing contaminants that most of you will be aware of over the last probably year and a half. The headlines that are just flashed before you there mostly relate to public water supplies, but cover a number of supplies in Cavan and Monaghan and Clare. Baileyborough, Cootehill, Newbliss and Shannon 6 Mile Bridge public water supplies have all been affected by do not consume notices for thousands of consumers over the last 18 months or so. And we know this isn't just confined to the public water supply system. Do not consume notices have been in place in group water schemes as well as a result of manganese exceedances in the water supply. So why is this happening? Well, we know that there has been, for most of these supplies, a deterioration in the raw water quality, and that has resulted in elevated levels of manganese being present in the water. There is a limit in the directive of 50 micrograms per litre for manganese, but there is also a health-based limit of 120 micrograms per litre. And generally, when consultation with the local authority and the HSE takes place, this results in a do not consume notice for all consumers on a supply affected where the health-based limit has been breached. There are treatment options available for manganese removal, but these can be complicated and they can take some time to have effect. What's important to try and figure out is why is this happening and what are the possible causes. And whilst we don't fully understand that yet, the Federation is hoping to be part of a research project that the EPA may be funding in 2022, and hopefully that will give us more information to find out what is going on here. It's possible that climate factors are a consideration. A number of these do not consume notices have been put in place during the summer period, but not all of them. So it's certainly one consideration that needs to be looked at. TRIHALOMETHANEs are basically formed during the disinfection process when chlorine reacts with natural organic matter in the water to give disinfection byproducts. The directive has a limit of 100 micrograms per litre. And as you can see from the diagram there, it's not just about being compliant with the THM's limit at the drinking water plant. There's also the distribution network and the various homes and businesses that are served by a private water supply that need to be compliant. There are various treatment options and network management options that need to be undertaken to ensure the level of THMs is kept below 100 and that our exposure is minimised. You will probably be aware that the ECJ has opened an infringement case against Ireland in relation to THMs, and in May 2020 they issued a reasoned opinion which said that Ireland has failed to take the measures necessary to ensure THM compliance in 31 public water supplies and 13 private group water schemes. This is very serious for Ireland, and you will also be aware that the Commission is tracking Ireland's progress for supplies on the reasoned opinion to ensure that they're compliant with the THM limit. The Department of Housing, Local Government and Heritage reports to the Commission on progress, and works here will include either the installation of treatment processes or other process optimisation works that need to be undertaken to comply with the limit. Okay, so the first half of my presentation has focused on some contaminants of concern, but I wanted to look now at the recast of the Drinking Water Directive and some of the contaminants that will be focused on into the future. Most of you will be aware that the new directive was signed just before Christmas, and it is required to be transposed by January 2023. The new recast Drinking Water Directive has reinforced water quality standards. It will tackle emerging pollutants and allow for the introduction of a watch list. It will introduce the risk-based approach or water safety plan approach, and it will harmonise the standards for materials and products in contact with drinking water. It will also require operational monitoring programmes specific to a water supply to be implemented. Other key features of the directive are that Member States must take measures to ensure better access to water, particularly for vulnerable or marginalised groups. Member States must ensure not to allow any increase in the pollution of waters used for the production of water intended for human consumption. And then we must put in place measures to promote the use of tap water, as well as reducing water leakages and increasing transparency around this. A number of new parameters will be required to be monitored under the directive, and I've covered some of these here and listed them off. Bisphenol A, chlorite, haloacetic acids, microsystems, and PFAS are just some of the list of new parameters. And you can see from the various headlines there that these chemicals and substances have long been in the media as to the risks that they may pose to our drinking water supplies, and that's why they've made the inclusion into the new directive. Some of the existing parameters within the directive will also be updated, with new limits for some of them becoming applicable after a number of years. For pesticides, Member States must define guide values for non-relevant metabolites. Lead, the current limit is 10 micrograms per litre. That will reduce to 5 micrograms per litre after 15 years in January 2036. As also chromium, the limit will reduce to 25 micrograms per litre after 15 years. These will present challenges to all water suppliers to ensure compliance, and a challenge that we must prepare for and take action to ensure we comply with the limits set out in the new directive. I suppose one of the most important things about the new directive is that it takes a risk-based approach to water safety and embeds the drinking water safety plan approach within it. Many of you will have already used this in your schemes, and it is really at the heart of what we're trying to achieve here. The directive requires a clear and appropriate distribution of roles and responsibilities between stakeholders within the catchment and within the source protection are defined in our legislation. This will mean that we'll bring together the three aspects: risk assessment, risk management, and risk communication to inform the actions that need to be taken to address the hazards that we identify for our water supplies. The risk assessment and risk management of the catchment areas for abstraction will need to be undertaken by July 2027. The risk assessment and management of the supply system, which is the water treatment system, will need to be done by July 2029, and there is a possibility that Member States can exempt supplies that supply between 10 and 100 metres cubed per day. The final risk assessment piece is for the domestic distribution system or the internal plumbing of our houses and businesses, and this is required to be done by July 2029, with a focus on priority premises such as healthcare settings, creches, nursing homes, those kind of environments. It requires that appropriate measures are taken to eliminate or reduce risk, and there is a focus on lead and Legionella. The requirements for the risk assessment for the domestic distribution system are new within the directive, and something that will be coming down the tracks at us into the future. I wanted to talk a little bit now about the catchment areas and why source protection is so important. This diagram here, which my colleagues in the Water Framework Directive team have supplied, shows a catchment area. And the curvy blue line is a river with various tributaries that is used to abstract water for both public and private drinking water supplies. The orange star and broken orange line are a public water supply abstraction and catchment. Within that, you can see there are a number of private group water scheme abstraction points and catchments represented by the red star and the broken red line. And within that as well, there are also a number of blue dots, which represent our private domestic wells. And you can see that a catchment is made up of all of these factors, all of which may contribute to what is going on in the raw water that is used for our drinking water supplies. As part of the requirements for the new directive, monitoring of all these elements will be required in the catchment. The monitoring will inform and characterise the risk that these elements pose. It will allow us to identify hazards and hazardous events and ultimately take action to mitigate and protect against them. This cyclical process will need to be undertaken many times, and that is how a drinking water safety plan will work. It will continuously evolve and develop as risks and hazards are identified and action is taken to mitigate against them. This brings with it a number of benefits. It provides a framework for drinking water source protection, which is something we have advocated for some time. It will build on our existing Water Framework Directive assessments, our monitoring and our knowledge, a lot of which we can harness to the betterment of our water supplies. It will allow for a collaborative approach from all stakeholders in the catchment and has the potential to improve both drinking water quality whilst also addressing our Water Framework Directive requirements. Where it is supported by evidence, it will allow reduced monitoring requirements to be undertaken by our water suppliers, and that may have benefits for some of the big water schemes where the evidence supports it. It also allows for early intervention to take action to address hazards and risks in the catchment that may pose a risk to our water supplies. But notwithstanding all that, it will pose a number of challenges for us all. There will inevitably be new roles and responsibilities for all stakeholders, and it will require a degree of both technical and local knowledge, both of which will be important to ensure we meet this challenge. We will need to learn from past experiences for the implementation of the Water Framework Directive and use those past experiences and lessons learned to ensure the Drinking Water Directive can be implemented effectively. Where there's a lack of evidence to support reduced monitoring for certain substances, some smaller supplies may struggle to demonstrate that they have the evidence to do this, and this will lead to a monitoring requirement to be ongoing for some time. And there's no doubt that the range of substances to be monitored will be a challenge for us all. I hope that has given you some ideas of the contaminants of concern that we have found in our private water supplies over the last few years, and some of the contaminants of concern that are coming down the tracks at us. Thanks very much for your time, and I hope everyone has a good day for the remainder of the webinar.